January 7th, 1945. A secure telephone line crackles to life between two command posts. On one end, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe, the man who planned D-Day, the architect of Nazi Germany's destruction. On the other end, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., America's most aggressive combat commander, standing in a frozen Belgian schoolhouse with his ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his hips. Eisenhower's voice is tight, controlled, barely containing volcanic rage. Montgomery had just held a press conference, and what he said could shatter the entire Western alliance. Patton listens, his jaw clenches, his knuckles turn white around the telephone receiver. The officers in the room watch their general's face turn from weathered tan to deep crimson. Then Patton speaks, 7 words that make Eisenhower's blood run cold. Fire him, or you can have my resignation. The room goes silent, not the silence of peace, the silence of a bomb with the pin pulled. Patton continues, his voice a razor. I will not serve under a British prima donna who steals credit for American blood. You have 24 hours to fix this, Ike. Or I walk, and I won't walk quietly. Eisenhower knows what this means. If Patton resigns in protest, Bradley will follow. Then other American generals. The entire command structure of the U.S. Army in Europe could collapse like a house of cards. The alliance with Britain, bought with rivers of blood across 2 world wars, could fracture at the moment of victory. The Germans, listening to intercepted radio chatter, are praying for exactly this. And Montgomery, he has no idea he just triggered the greatest command crisis of World War II. But here's what history books don't tell you. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or bruised egos. This was about something far more dangerous. Because in that same moment, 50,000 German soldiers were preparing a breakout, an attempt that could have reversed everything the Allies had achieved. The trap around the Bulge was closing, but it hadn't closed yet. And if the Allied High Command tore itself apart while the Wehrmacht still had fight left in it, the road to Berlin could turn into the road to disaster. This is the untold story of the 72 hours that nearly destroyed the alliance. The story of how personal pride almost handed Hitler the miracle he was praying for. The story of military genius, political catastrophe, and a desperate race against time in the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest. What happened next would determine not just who won the Battle of the Bulge, but whether the Western Allies could finish the war together, or whether they would finish each other first. December 27th, 1944, 24 hours after relief. The world is celebrating. American newspapers trumpet the breakthrough to Bastogne as the turning point of the battle. Patton saves the 101st, screams the headline in Stars and Stripes. In London, Churchill raises a glass of brandy to American courage. In Washington, Roosevelt tells his cabinet that the German offensive has been stopped. But inside the operations room at SHAEF headquarters, the maps tell a very different story. Yes, Patton's Third Army had smashed through to Bastogne. Yes, the 101st Airborne was no longer surrounded. But look at the map. Really look at it. The corridor to Bastogne was barely 3 miles wide. A single muddy road under constant artillery bombardment from German 88mm guns positioned on the surrounding hills. Supply trucks had to run a gauntlet of fire just to deliver ammunition and medical supplies. The lifeline could be cut again at any moment, and the Bulge itself, still there, still massive. A grotesque tumor of German forces jutting 40 miles into Allied lines. Inside that Bulge, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most skilled commanders. The 1st SS, Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Führer's personal guard unit, fanatics who would never surrender. The 2nd Panzer Division, veterans of Poland, France, and Russia. The Panzer Lehr Division, an elite formation of experienced tank commanders. The Führer Bakelite Brigade, equipped with the newest King Tiger tanks, nearly impervious to Allied fire. Over 600 tanks, 1,800 artillery pieces, 50,000 battle-hardened soldiers, and every single one of them was trapped. Eisenhower understood what had to happen next. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was an execution. The Germans had to be crushed before they could retreat to the Siegfried Line fortifications on the German border. If they escaped with their heavy equipment intact, they would use those same tanks and guns to bleed the Allies white during the final push into Germany. The Wehrmacht had to be destroyed here, in Belgium, in the snow, with no mercy and no escape. But how do you destroy an army of 50,000 men who know they're going to die anyway? Eisenhower called a meeting of his senior commanders for December 28th at Verdun, the same city where 1 million men had died in World War I's most horrific meat grinder. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. 3 men entered that meeting room with 3 completely different visions of how to win. George S. Patton Jr. wanted to attack immediately from the south, while simultaneously launching a massive offensive from the north, cutting the base of the Bulge and trapping the entire German force in a pocket of steel and fire. "We've got them by the balls," he told Eisenhower. "Now we squeeze until they pop." His strategy was simple: speed, aggression, and overwhelming firepower. Hit them before they can dig in. Hit them before they can retreat. Hit them until nothing moves. Bernard Law Montgomery wanted to wait. The British Field Marshal, commanding the northern shoulder of the Bulge, insisted that a premature attack in terrible weather with insufficient supplies would lead to catastrophic casualties. He wanted to spend 2 weeks building up ammunition reserves, improving supply lines, and waiting for better weather so Allied air power could support the offensive. His strategy: methodical, careful, by the book. Win the battle without wasting lives. Dwight Eisenhower was caught between 2 philosophies of war. He knew Patton was right about the strategic opportunity. Every day of delay allowed more Germans to escape. But he also knew Montgomery had a point about casualties. The American public was already reeling from the losses in the Ardennes. How many more mothers needed to receive telegrams that started with, "We regret to inform you"? But there was a 4th voice in this debate, a voice that wasn't in the room but whose shadow hung over every decision: Adolf Hitler. And the Führer had just made a decision that would doom his own army. Inside the Führer bunker in Berlin, reality had ceased to exist. Adolf Hitler stood over a map table, his left hand trembling from Parkinson's disease, his eyes bloodshot from insomnia and amphetamine injections administered by his personal physician. Around him stood the German High Command, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, General Alfred Jodl, and a handful of junior officers too terrified to speak truth to power. On the map, colored pins showed the position of German forces in the Ardennes. To any rational military mind, the situation was clear. The offensive had failed. Bastogne hadn't fallen. American reinforcements were flooding into the sector. The weather was clearing, which meant Allied aircraft would soon own the skies again. The smart move, the only move, was to authorize a fighting withdrawal, while the 5th Panzer Army still had fuel in its tanks. But Hitler was no longer capable of rational military thought. He jabbed a finger at the map and issued an order that sentenced thousands of his soldiers to death. Not one step back. Every Sioux village will be held. Every road will be defended. The enemy must be made to bleed for every meter. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B in the field, received this order via encrypted teletype. He read it 3 times, hoping the words would somehow change. They didn't. Model was one of Germany's most brilliant defensive commanders, the Führer's fireman, sent to crisis points across the Eastern Front to stabilize collapsing situations. He had stopped Soviet offensives that everyone else thought were unstoppable. He understood the mathematics of warfare with cold clarity. And the mathematics of the Ardennes were simple. His army was doomed. The Germans were out of fuel, literally. Panzer divisions that had started the offensive with 150 tanks were down to 40 or 50 functional vehicles. Not because they'd been destroyed, but because they'd run out of gasoline and had been abandoned on the roadside. The grand strategy had depended on capturing American fuel dumps. They'd failed. Now German soldiers were siphoning gas from wrecked vehicles just to move a handful of tanks a few more miles. They were out of ammunition. Artillery batteries were rationing shells, firing only at the most critical targets. Machine gunners were down to their last belts. The Luftwaffe had made a surprise attack on Allied airfields on New Year's Day 1945, Operation Bodenplatte, and lost nearly 300 aircraft they could never replace. German air cover had gone from minimal to non-existent. They were out of time. Every hour, more American divisions arrived from reserve positions. Every hour, Allied artillery grew denser. Every hour, the noose tightened. Model sent an encrypted message back to Berlin. Request permission to conduct strategic withdrawal to defensible positions along the West Wall. Current position untenable. Estimate 60% equipment loss if forced to hold current lines. Hitler's response came within an hour. Request denied. Hold all. Ground. Führer orders. No retreat. Model crumpled the message in his fist. He looked at his chief of staff and said quietly, "Then we will hold, and we will die." But here's what most people don't understand about the German army in January 1945. They kept fighting anyway. Not because they believed in victory. They knew victory was impossible. Not because they loved Hitler. Many of them despised him by this point. They fought because they were professionals. Because their comrades were beside them. Because surrender meant Soviet gulags or American prison camps. Because their homeland was about to be invaded, and their families were in the path of two vengeful armies. And because some of them, particularly the SS units, had committed such monstrous war crimes that they knew surrender meant a rope. So when Patton's Third Army began pushing north from Bastogne on January 1st, 1945, they weren't attacking a defeated enemy retreating in panic. They were attacking cornered, wolves with nothing left to lose. Private First Class James Jimmy Hendricks, 26th Infantry Division, 3rd Army, crouched in a frozen foxhole outside the village of Bulge, Luxembourg. It was January the 2nd, 1945. Temperature 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill below zero. Jimmy had been in this foxhole for 16 hours. His boots were frozen solid. He couldn't feel his toes, hadn't felt them in 3 days. His M1 Garand rifle was so cold that touching the metal with bare skin would tear off a layer of flesh. His canteen was frozen into a useless block of ice. The order came down at 600 hours. Advance north. Objective, village of Wiltz, 8 miles ahead. 8 miles doesn't sound like much. On a normal day, a good walker could cover that in 3 hours. It took Jimmy's company 4 days of continuous combat to advance 3 miles. Here's why. The Germans had turned every building, every tree line, every ditch into a fortress. They had had 2 weeks to dig in. While waiting for the American counteroffensive, machine gun nests camouflaged in snow, anti-tank guns hidden in barns, snipers in church steeples, mines buried under every road, every path, every trail. The American advance followed a horrifying pattern, repeated hundreds of times across dozens of villages. Step 1, artillery bombardment. American B-5mm and 105mm howitzers would pulverize a target area for 30 minutes, turning buildings into rubble and hopefully killing the defenders. Step 2, infantry advance. Companies of frozen, exhausted GIs would move forward through waist-deep snow, expecting the Germans to be dead. Step 3, the Germans weren't dead. Machine gun fire would erupt from the rubble. Men would fall screaming, their blood turning the white snow crimson. The company would dive for cover and call for tank support. Step 4, Sherman tanks would lumber forward, their treads slipping on the ice. Then, crack, an 88mm armor-piercing round would punch through the Sherman's thin armor, turning the interior into a blast furnace. The crew that didn't burn to death would bail out into German machine gun fire. Step 5, more artillery, more infantry, more casualties, house by house, room by room, sometimes using flamethrowers to burn out defenders who refused to surrender. Step 6, the village would finally be cleared. Medics would move through, separating the dead from the dying. The company would count its losses, usually 20–30% casualties for a single village, then receive orders to advance to the next village, and the whole nightmare would start again. Jimi Hendrix made it through the first village, and the second. On the third day, outside a crossroads called Niederbompach, he didn't. A German sniper put a bullet through his chest from 300 yards away. He died in a drainage ditch, holding a photograph of his wife and baby daughter, while a medic tried desperately to stop the bleeding with frozen hands. He was 22 years old. His death doesn't appear in any history book. His name is carved on a white cross in Luxembourg American Cemetery. one of 5,076 crosses in neat rows. But Jimmy's story was repeated 10,000 times across the Ardennes in January 1945. Let me give you some numbers that history often glosses over. Average daily temperature, 15 to 25 degrees, 9 to 4 degrees. American casualties from frostbite and trench foot. Over 15,000 soldiers, entire divisions pulled from the line because their feet had turned gangrenous average life expectancy of a Sherman tank in combat. 11 days American artillery shells fired per day. 50,000, 80,000 rounds. German artillery shells fired per day. 5,000, 8,000, they were running out. Advance rate, 1 to 2 miles per day at a cost of 300, 500 casualties per division. Villages destroyed, over 150 Belgian and Luxembourg towns reduced to ruins. This wasn't warfare as we imagine it from movies. This was industrial-scale slaughter in sub-zero temperatures. Patton drove his Jeep to the front lines constantly, standing in the snow, yelling at traffic jams of vehicles, screaming at officers to keep moving. His 3rd Army staff officers feared for his life. Several times German artillery landed within 100 yards of his position. He didn't care. He had a stopwatch in his head. Every hour the trap remained open, more Germans escaped. Every delay meant more American boys would die on German soil instead of Belgian soil. But the northern pincer, Montgomery's forces, was moving at a crawl. And that's when the crisis erupted. January 7th, 1945. A small schoolhouse in Zonhoven, Belgium. Field Marshal Bernard Law. Montgomery stood before a gathering of war correspondents from Britain and America. He wore his trademark black beret, his uniform pressed and immaculate despite the mud and snow outside. Behind him, a map of the Ardennes showed the battle lines. Montgomery was about to make the biggest public relations blunder of the entire war. He began to speak, his voice carrying the clipped, superior tone of a British aristocrat addressing slow students. The battle has been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. The American reporters shifted uncomfortably. Handled? Montgomery had been given temporary command of 2 American armies, the 1st and 9th, during the height of the German breakthrough. But it was American soldiers who had held at Bastogne. American soldiers who had stopped the German spearheads at Elsenborn Ridge. American armor that had destroyed the 2nd Panzer Division at Celle. But Montgomery continued. The first thing to be done was to head off the enemy from the tender spots and vital places. Having halted the enemy, we then turned on him and destroyed him. British troops played a critical role in tidying up the battlefield and reorganizing American forces for counterattack. Tidying up? He actually said tidying up, as if American soldiers dying in frozen foxholes were nothing more than a messy room that needed British supervision to clean. He barely mentioned Patton's name, didn't mention the 101st Airborne's heroic stand, spoke as if the entire battle had been won primarily through his own tactical genius and British steadiness saving the disorganized Americans. One American correspondent asked pointedly, "Sir, what role did General Patton's 3rd Army play in the victory?" Montgomery waved his hand dismissively. Patton's advance was useful, certainly, but the strategic picture required a more methodical approach to avoid unnecessary casualties. The press conference ended. The reporters filed out. And then, the explosion began. At Omar Bradley's headquarters, Luxembourg City. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group and Patton's direct superior, received a transcript of Montgomery's remarks at 1600 hours. Bradley was known as the GI's general. Quiet, immodest, thoughtful. He rarely raised his voice. His staff officers said they'd never seen him truly angry, until that moment. Bradley read the transcript 3 times. Then he picked up his telephone and called Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. "Bedell, if Montgomery is not publicly rebuked for this outrageous distortion of the facts, I am submitting my resignation. I will not serve under a command structure that allows the British to claim credit for American blood. This is intolerable." His voice was shaking, not with rage, but with something colder. Betrayal. At Patton's headquarters, Luxembourg. When Patton heard what Montgomery had said, his reaction was louder. "That son of a bitch!" The bellow could be heard 3 rooms away. Officers froze. Typewriters stopped clicking. Everyone in headquarters knew what was coming. Patton stormed into the communications room and demanded a direct line to Eisenhower. When told Eisenhower was in a meeting, Patton's response was unprintable, and that's saying something for a man whose profanity was legendary. Finally, Eisenhower took the call. "Ike, you have to fix this. Now. Today." Montgomery just claimed credit for the entire victory and barely mentioned American contributions. "My men are dying in the snow, while that pompous British bastard holds press conferences about how he tidied up our mess. If this stands, if there is no public correction, then I resign. And I will not resign quietly." Eisenhower tried to calm him. "George, I know it's frustrating, but we need to maintain alliance unity." "Screw alliance unity. My soldiers deserve better than this. Bradley deserves better. If you won't stand up for us, then find yourself a new Third Army commander. Effective immediately." The line went dead. Patton had hung up on the Supreme Commander. At SHAEF headquarters, Versailles, Dwight Eisenhower sat at his desk, his head in his hands. This was his nightmare. Scenario: the alliance fracturing at the moment of victory. Eisenhower's genius wasn't tactical. Patton was better at battlefield maneuver, Montgomery better at set-piece battles. Eisenhower's genius was political, keeping the coalition together despite massive egos, conflicting national interests, and limited resources. But Montgomery had just thrown a grenade into that carefully maintained alliance. If Patton resigned, Bradley would follow. He'd already threatened as much. If both American generals walked away in protest, the political fallout would be catastrophic. Congress would demand answers. The American public would be outraged. Roosevelt would be forced to intervene. And the Germans, they would celebrate. The greatest gift Hitler could receive, the Allied High Command tearing itself apart. Eisenhower made a decision. He began drafting a message to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London. The current command arrangement in Northwest Europe has become untenable due to ongoing disputes between national commanders. I request immediate clarification. Do I have the authority to relieve Field Marshal Montgomery of command if necessary for operational effectiveness? If not, I respectfully request to be relieved myself and replaced with a commander who has full authority over all forces, regardless of nationality. It was an ultimatum. Either I get full control, or you can find someone else to run this war. He encrypted the message, prepared to send it. And then his telephone rang. It was Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister intervenes. Churchill had been informed of the crisis within hours. British intelligence officers monitoring American radio chatter heard the fury in American communications. The Prime Minister understood immediately. If this wasn't fixed, the alliance could collapse. And Britain needed America more than America needed Britain. Churchill told Eisenhower, "I will address this personally. Do not send that message. Yet. Give me 48 hours." On January 18th, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons in London and delivered a speech that was really an apology. "I have seen it suggested that the terrific battle which has been proceeding since December 16th on the American front is an Anglo-American battle. In fact, however, the United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. Care must be taken not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." He praised Eisenhower. He praised Bradley. He praised Patton by name. He praised American soldiers. He never mentioned Montgomery. The message was clear. Britain was grateful for American sacrifice and would not tolerate anyone, even a British field marshal, undermining that alliance. The crisis subsides, but doesn't end. Churchill's speech diffused the immediate political bomb. Patton didn't resign. Bradley stayed. Eisenhower kept his command. But the damage was done. The personal relationships were poisoned. Patton would never trust Montgomery again. Bradley refused to attend meetings where Montgomery was present. Eisenhower had to manage 2 separate commands that barely spoke to each other. And critically, the operational delay caused by this command crisis gave the Germans precious extra days to begin their withdrawal, which brings us to the race against time. By January 13th, despite the political chaos at the top, the Allied military machine was finally synchronized. From the south, Patton's Third Army, battered, frozen, but relentless, was pushing north through villages with names no American had ever heard before and would never forget: Wiltz, Clairvaux, Bourscheid, Diekirch. From the north, Montgomery's First Army, finally unleashed, was grinding southward through equally brutal terrain: La Roche, Samray, Baraque de Freiture. The objective? Link up at the town of Houffalize, Belgium, and cut the Bulge in half. The Germans knew exactly what was coming. Houffalize sat in a steep valley along the Orthe River, one of the few practical roads for German forces trying to retreat eastward. If the Americans took Houffalize, thousands of German soldiers would be trapped to the west with no escape route. So they defended it like their lives depended on it, because they did. From the south, the U.S. 11th Armored Division, nicknamed Thunderbolt, led Patton's spearhead. From the north, the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, led the First Army advance. Between them, 12 miles of frozen hell defended by the remnants of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen. The fighting in those final 2 weeks of January was perhaps the most vicious of the entire battle. Both sides knew this was the endgame. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew they were covering the retreat of their comrades. The Americans fought with the fury of men who had been cold and hungry and scared for 6 weeks and just wanted this nightmare to end. Villages were fought for house to house, sometimes room to room. Soldiers threw grenades through windows, charged through doorways with fixed bayonets, shot enemies at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. The cold had become its own enemy. Soldiers on both sides died of hypothermia in their foxholes, simply freezing to death during the night. Medical evacuation vehicles couldn't navigate the icy roads. Wounded men often died before reaching aid stations. Frostbite caused more casualties than German bullets in some units, but the American advantage in artillery and air power was finally telling. Once the weather cleared on January 15th, Allied fighter bombers appeared in the sky like angels of death. P-47, Thunderbolts, and P-38. Lightning strafed German columns retreating along the roads. The roads became killing zones, burning vehicles, dead horses, abandoned equipment stretched for miles. The Germans called it the fighter-bomber carousel, Allied aircraft circling overhead in shifts, attacking anything that moved. At 09:10 hours, a patrol from the 41st Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 11th Armored Division, entered Houffalize from the south. The town was a smoking ruin, 90% of the buildings destroyed by artillery and bombing. At 09:15 hours, a patrol from the 2nd Armored Division entered from the north. The two patrols met at a destroyed bridge over the Orthe River. There were no cameras, no generals, no ceremony. Just exhausted, filthy soldiers shaking hands, sharing cigarettes, and asking each other if it was finally over. Staff Sergeant Mike Kozlowski, 41st Cavalry, described the moment years later. "We'd been fighting for 6 weeks straight. I hadn't had a hot meal in a month. My feet were black with frostbite. 3 of my best friends were dead. And then I see these guys coming from the other direction, and they look just like us, tired, beat to hell, ready to drop. We shook hands and someone said, 'We did it. We cut the bastards in half.' And that was it. No celebration. We were too damn tired to celebrate. We just sat down in the snow and waited for orders to keep moving." The strategic impact. With Houffalize captured, the Bulge was severed. German forces to the west of the town were cut off from their supply lines and retreat routes. Over the next 10 days, they would be systematically destroyed or forced to surrender. The Germans to the east of Houffalize, about 60% of the force that had started the offensive, managed to retreat back to the Siegfried Line, but they left behind almost all their heavy equipment. Hundreds of tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, artillery pieces blown up to prevent capture, supply trucks burned. The 5th Panzer Army, which had started the offensive with 150,000 men and 600 tanks, limped back to Germany with maybe 80,000 men and less than 100 operational tanks. Army Group B had been gutted. By January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was officially over. The The front lines had been restored to roughly where they'd been on December 15th, before the German offensive began. 6 weeks of fighting, tens of thousands of casualties, hundreds of destroyed villages, and the map looked almost the same as it had before the battle started. But strategically, everything had changed. The American losses, total casualties, 89,000 killed, wounded, missing, captured. Killed in action, 19,000 tank and vehicle losses. Over 700 armored vehicles destroyed, aircraft losses, 592 planes. To put this in perspective, the Battle of the Bulge inflicted more American casualties than the entire Pacific campaign from Pearl Harbor to Midway. It was the bloodiest battle in U.S. Army history, surpassing even Gettysburg. The 106th Infantry Division was virtually annihilated. It entered the battle with 14,000 men and suffered 8,600 casualties in the first 3 days. The 28th Infantry Division, which had marched victoriously through liberated Paris in August, was shattered. It suffered 6,200 casualties and had to be pulled from the line for complete reconstitution. Entire companies were wiped out. Soldiers who had survived D-Day and the Battle of Normandy died in frozen foxholes in Belgium. The German losses, total casualties, 100,000 killed, wounded, missing. Tank losses, 800 plus panzers destroyed or abandoned, aircraft losses, 1,000 plus planes, including the disastrous Bodenplatte attack. Strategic reserves completely exhausted, but the numbers don't tell the full story. Germany lost what it could never replace: its last mobile reserves, its most experienced panzer crews, its final fuel stocks, its remaining tactical aircraft. After the Bulge, Germany was incapable of launching another strategic offensive. The Wehrmacht would spend the next 4 months fighting defensive battles while retreating toward Berlin. Hitler's gamble had not only failed, it had accelerated Germany's defeat by months. The human cost. Behind every number was a person, a name, a family that received a telegram. Private Thomas Callahan, 19, from Boston, killed January 4th near Bastogne. His mother received the notification on January 10th, her birthday. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, 24, from Munich, died January 8th when his tank was hit by American artillery. His wife was 8 months pregnant with their first child, Private Jean-Baptiste Leclerc, 22, Belgian civilian, killed by German artillery while hiding in his farmhouse cellar with his family. The Battle of the Bulge also killed thousands of Belgian civilians, caught between armies, bombed by both sides, starved by the destruction of infrastructure. So, what was the Battle of the Bulge really about? On the surface, it was Hitler's last desperate throw of the dice, a delusional offensive designed to split the Allies and buy time. It failed completely. The Germans were pushed back to their starting lines within 6 weeks. They lost irreplaceable resources. The road to Berlin was now wide open, but if you dig deeper, the Battle of the Bulge was about something more profound. It was proof that the Allied coalition, despite all its internal tensions, could survive existential crisis. The Americans and British nearly tore themselves apart over ego and national pride. Montgomery's arrogance almost shattered the alliance. Patton's ultimatum could have triggered a command collapse, but Churchill intervened. Eisenhower held firm, and the coalition survived. That's the real victory of the Bulge, not the military outcome, but the political resilience. The Nazis had bet that Allied unity was fragile, that the Americans and British would turn on each other under pressure. They were wrong. It was proof that Nazi Germany was finished. The Bulge was Germany's last card. They bet everything. All their reserves, all their fuel, all their remaining strength on one roll of the dice, and they lost. After the Bulge, there were no more German miracle weapons, no more surprise offensives, no more strategic options, only retreat, collapse, and surrender. The road from Houffalize led directly to the Rhine crossings, the encirclement of the Ruhr, the link-up with Soviet forces at the Elbe, and finally to the bunker in Berlin, where Hitler would shoot himself on April 30th, 1945. The Bulge didn't just stop Germany's last offensive. It broke the Wehrmacht's back. It was proof that leadership matters. Patton's ability to turn his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and attack within 48 hours remains one of the most impressive logistical feats in military history. Military colleges still study his staff planning. Eisenhower's political skill in managing coalition warfare under impossible pressure proved that grand strategy requires more than tactical brilliance. It requires the ability to manage egos, balance competing interests, and keep allies focused on the common enemy. Even Montgomery, for all his arrogance, demonstrated the value of careful preparation. His northern attack, though slow to start, was methodically executed and suffered fewer casualties per mile gained than Patton's more aggressive approach. Different styles, different philosophies, all necessary. And it was proof that soldiers pay for generals' decisions. Every strategic debate, every political crisis, every delayed order translated into dead soldiers in frozen foxholes. When Montgomery delayed his attack to prepare properly, German machine gunners had more time to dig in. More Americans died. When Patton pushed his men beyond exhaustion to close the trap faster, soldiers died of frostbite and exposure, even when they weren't under fire. When Hitler ordered no retreat, thousands of German soldiers were needlessly killed or captured when they could have withdrawn to fight another day. The Battle of the Bulge is a reminder that war is not an abstract chess game. Every pin on a map represents hundreds of human beings who bleed, freeze, suffer, and die based on decisions made by men in warm headquarters far from the front lines. So, let me ask you this. If you were Eisenhower on January 7th, 1945, what would you have done? Would you have fired Montgomery for his insulting press conference, risking a political crisis with Britain? Or would you have sacrificed American pride to keep the alliance together, knowing that unity was essential for final victory? Would you have sided with Patton's aggressive strategy, accepting higher casualties for faster victory? Or would you have endorsed Montgomery's caution, saving lives but allowing more Germans to escape? These weren't easy decisions. There were no perfect answers, only terrible choices with profound consequences. That's what makes the Battle of the Bulge so compelling. It wasn't just about tactics and battles. It was about leadership under impossible pressure, about coalition warfare, about the friction between national pride and strategic necessity, and about the soldiers who paid the price for every decision. The next time you see a white cross in a military cemetery, remember, that person died not in a glorious charge or a heroic last stand, but probably cold, scared, and far from home. Because generals argued about strategy and politicians worried about prestige. That's the real story of the Battle of the Bulge. If you found this deep dive into the command crisis and strategic complexity fascinating, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Next episode, we're covering the race to the Rhine, when Patton and Montgomery literally competed to be the first across the river into Germany, turning Allied strategy into a personal rivalry that almost got soldiers killed for nothing but ego. Drop a comment, Team Patton or Team Montgomery. Who was right about how to finish the war? And remember, history isn't about perfect heroes and obvious villains. It's about complicated people making difficult decisions under terrible pressure. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong, but the consequences are always paid in blood.